So this is by a man named Steve Patterson. It's on his site and published in about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, June 25th, 2021, in which he posits that we are, in fact, and have been, not that we are now entering, but that we have been in a dark age. And although he doesn't explore it in this essay, in part one, which is so far the only part yet published, but that we actually may be seeing signs that we could be emerging from that dark age, which is rather hopeful. I'm not sure. I'd like to see the evidence for that laid out as clearly as he's laid out the evidence for the idea that we are actually in a dark age now. I just want to share a few bits and have us talk about the bits that I'm sharing from this. Darkness everywhere, Patterson writes. And again, the thesis is we are in a dark age, and we have been, in fact, for most of since early in the 20th century. He says, by a dark age, I do not mean that all modern beliefs are false. The earth is indeed round. Indeed, I mean that all of our structures of knowledge are plagued by errors at all levels, from the trivial to the profound, periphery to the fundamental. Nothing that you've been taught can be believed because you were taught it. Nothing can be believed because others believe it. No idea is trustworthy because it's written in a textbook. And this will resonate with many of our viewers, of course. This is what it looks like. This is what it feels like in the modern era to say you can't trust an authority on the basis that they are an authority. And every authority absolutely must earn your trust before they warrant being let into your brain, frankly. And of course, that's a dicey business, because how is it that you let someone into your brain in order to figure out if you do in fact trust them without having let them in where they can perhaps muck things up and muddle about with how you're thinking?
So there are a number of things. Obviously, you and I were both struck by this essay. I think we do need to say, and I've now confirmed with him, I didn't know who this person was until I'd read this essay, and then I reached out to him and confirmed that, in fact, there is a reference in there. He mentions the scientist who discovers there's a problem with lab rats. I believe he's referring to me. I'm pretty sure that's right, but he is at least aware of us, and so some of this may not be totally independent. But there is a fact here, which is that we have converged on an understanding. And this is a strongly suggestive piece of evidence, right? The idea that multiple people starting in different places arrive at the same conclusion, which is that, we have a system in which our mechanism for figuring out what is true is so broadly untrustworthy that, in fact, you cannot look at a textbook and say this is generally right.
Right.
Now, of course, this puts you, he doesn't mention in this essay, but this, of course, puts you in a familiar predicament, because Descartes was, of course, troubled by the fact that almost everything...
René Descartes?
René Descartes.
I heard Dick Hart.
Descartes.
Who is this? I don't know who we're talking about.
Dick Gephardt was in a totally different predicament. But
okay.
Descartes
was in a predicament.
He was in a predicament because he recognized that almost everything he knew, he did not know directly, and that raised the possibility that a lot of it just simply wasn't right. Now, of course, you can absolutely paralyze yourself with that recognition. So the question is, what do you do? How much do you accept because people basically generally believe it? And how much are you skeptical of things that people generally believe because sometimes those things are dead wrong? There's a kind of an art form to figuring out how to separate the wheat from the chaff.
And especially in the modern era, when there is so much to know, when no human being could possibly know all of the things that some human beings know, you have to decide either to be completely unaware of a huge fraction of what other human beings talk about, and we all do that to some degree, and you have to figure out to some degree who is it that you're going to outsource your thinking to on X topic. And and we'll get here, I'm going to just quickly walk through as we talk, each of his 6 main points, each of his 6 main sort of lines of evidence for why he thinks we're in a dark age now. And part of what we're seeing is that people have outsourced, frankly, science. So many people decided, for a lot of reasons, many of which we've talked about on air, that, I don't do science. I'm not mathy. I don't do that sort of thing. And part of that is because some number of people really, aren't that good at it. It's not what they're drawn to, but a lot of it is about a really crappy early educational system, which teaches science badly, which teaches math badly. And so confirms for people that they're not good at things which they certainly could have been good at and actually are obliged to at least be literate in. I've made the point on DarkHorse before that being illiterate is not tolerated in coastal intelligentsia circles, whereas being innumerate is actually almost a badge of honor. Like you can talk about being math phobic or innumerate and have people say, well, of course aren't we all? And you certainly wouldn't be able to say that about your ability to read a newspaper article. But if you acknowledge that actually you just kind of gloss over even the really basic math presented in newspaper articles, that explains in part why even the really basic math presented in newspaper articles is so often bad and wrong, because no one seems to be checking it.
Yeah, like literally no one is checking it well enough for it to get caught before, it emerges in public. Just the most jaw-dropping,
right.
Errors, orders of magnitude off, and transparently so, for example. But so there are a number of things. One, to notice that we are in some kind of a dark age is like step one. Step two is to figure out what to do about it, right? How, are you going to allow your thinking process to just be completely ground to a halt by the fact that you can't trust things? Or are you going to figure out, which ice is thick enough for you to put your weight on and which ice isn't? And, so there are little tricks like there are features of a thought process. If you're trying to make headway on a difficult problem, sometimes there's something that you have to believe in order to make progress downstream that is suspect. And the question is, how do you allow that placeholder belief to exist while not compromising everything that you build on top of it? And so you sort of have to maintain an awareness of what rests on the truth of this thing, which I suspect probably isn't quite true, and to what extent if it is refined and it turns out to be sort of 80% of the way there, what falls apart of what you've just done because right. Some assumption was off by a substantial amount. Yeah, it requires a sort of a probabilistic kind of thinking about decision trees, including intellectual decision trees, wherein does the limb that you climb out on in order to explore some idea, if it were an actual tree, it would need to absolutely 100% bear your weight. And if it is completely rotten, it will fall immediately, and hopefully that will be revealed too in the metaphorical space of ideas. But what about if it's not exactly what you think it is, and if you start jumping up and down on it, it would start to crack, but it's good enough for now? Like, what of the things that you are going to try to explore, I guess downstream, I want to say upstream here, but downstream of that decision to go out on that limb is contingent on you being on exactly that limb, and what isn't. This is complexity space. This is hard, and it's impossible to do perfectly. Well, and that's the thing. It doesn't have to be perfect. Right. But actually, it occurs to me, now that we're talking about it, that when done correctly, meta-analysis is a formalization of this process. You can't do meta-analysis on informal topics. It has to be, it's basically a way of compiling data that was collected in different ways into a synthetic analysis. But the point is, in a meta-analysis, if you discover that one of the studies in question was either badly done, right, that there's some terrible flaw in it, or that it wasn't done at all and it's a fraud, then the point is, it isn't that, well, that analysis was inside of your meta-analysis. Your meta-analysis is garbage. The answer is, okay, what if we turn that one to zero? What happens to the remainder of the analysis? Because you know exactly how contingent the conclusion was on any given piece of evidence. So the question is, how do you take that line of logic and apply it to things that are not algorithmic, right? How do you figure out what's true in a world of uncertain data that you can't check, or uncertain evidence? I'm going to try to stop talking about data because it's really evidence that matters. But I will say, so I think I said some weeks ago that I had occasion to go back to my own Twitter feed and search it for the term dark age. And that I found that I had been tweeting about a dark age since 2009 when I signed up for Twitter. And I know that I was talking about it before then, but at least I can go back that far and say, not a new thought. The idea that the dark age might go back to early in the 20th century, I had not.
Yep,
I hadn't thought that.
That's a new idea for me as well, although it's consistent with a lot of what we have been talking about with regard to the financial model of the modern university and of science in particular, playing into people's worst instincts around who to trust and where the incentives are. Yes, and the incentives, not only do they pollute everything that comes out of that structure so that it is suspect, but they also train the people who might otherwise have become high quality scientists to become the inverse, right? By putting them through a sales training program, you take them out of the mind frame of falsification. Yeah. And so at the conference in Bath, one of the things that I said that apparently resonated with people was... So this is just for people who aren't paying as close attention. Right. Yes. So I went to this conference in Bath, which was a lot of COVID dissidence was the central sort of theme of the conference. And I was hosting a panel on the question of how do we recapture science? And my contention was you can't, because even if you fixed all of the incentives so that it would work, there aren't enough people in it who remember how to do it, such that if you fixed it and rebooted it, it wouldn't run. You have to rebuild it, right? And that is, it's just happenstance, I guess, but it resonates very well with this essay in the sense that, yes, the system that is supposed to figure out what's true has been diverted into some other activity. And now it's not like nobody knows how to do it, but the system is mostly a Potemkin village of science. It's not the real thing. Yeah. So Patterson, I think is arguing, although I don't think he explicitly does it here, that the failure of academia in concert, in synchronicity with the rise of academia as producing what the world is supposed to regard as the people who are authorities on all the subjects, is the combination that has taken us down. And so certainly in science, we see this. So, you need what's called a terminal degree. You need a PhD or an MD, depending, in order to have sort of standing in science or medicine, by which you then are allowed to say things in many circles. And, this is a style of thinking about scientific thinking and medical thinking that we have been arguing against since before we ourselves had PhDs. Yep. And of course, it is easier for people with the terminal degrees that are required by the system to say, actually, that's a terrible metric. And it's a terrible metric because of all of the ways that the system is actually canalizing people, also cannibalizing people in a way, but canalizing people, slotting people into highly specialist regimes out of which they cannot see. And once there, it becomes both difficult to think and it becomes difficult to choose to go outside, because now their entire livelihoods depend on being in this, in this path, in this canal, to use the developmental term, canalized.